Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the WorldTeach Ecuador Year webinar. We are very excited to have you on the line. My name is Caitlin Ivester, and I'm the Director of Communications at WorldTeach, and I'm really eager to share more with you about our program in Ecuador tonight. So tonight we'll discuss training, placements, culture, and the volunteer experience in the local classroom in Ecuador and the broader community. And amongst our listeners this evening, we have some new applicants, those that have just been accepted into the program, and others that are interested in learning more about WorldTeach in Ecuador, wherever you come from. So we also have a very distinguished panel made up of a current Ecuador volunteer and a current Ecuador assistant field director. So we're really excited to get their perspectives on the program as well. So to start, let's go over our agenda. We'll spend a few minutes meeting our panelists and the local field staff and learning a bit about their backgrounds. And then we'll get into some of the topics of discussion that you see listed here. Think of it as your journey through the program and what to expect and prepare for during your time in Ecuador. This will include topics like arrival, orientation, day-to-day life in your placement, immersion strategies, the volunteer experience in the classroom, among other topics. And finally, we'll go over the application process, qualifications and deadlines, along with program fees and support. And then at the end, we'll dedicate some time to a question and answer session with our panelists. Throughout the webinar, just so you know how GoToWebinar works, you can submit questions through the chat function that you should see on your screen. We will usually wait until the end to address them as a group unless one seems particularly pertinent in the moment. But if you chat in your question, then you're sure to get it answered by the end of the Q&A session. All right, well, for now, let's continue on and have our panelists introduce themselves. And from here on out, they'll be the stars of the show. All right, so we are very lucky to have two representatives of the Ecuador program joining us tonight. One is a current Ecuador volunteer, and the other a part of the current WorldTeach Ecuador field staff, and also an Ecuador alum. So I'll have you both introduce yourselves briefly, and we'll start with Genevieve. So Genevieve, can you tell us where are you placed in Ecuador, and then maybe a little bit about how you heard about WorldTeach and why you decided to join the program?
Yeah, for sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Genevieve Heitkamp. I'm a current Ecuador volunteer. I'm currently placed in Quito, so the main capital city of Ecuador. I originally heard about WorldTeach, so I graduated from the University of Notre Dame, and WorldTeach is heavily involved, I guess, in recruiting, so to speak, from Notre Dame. So I had originally heard about WorldTeach at a post-service career fair at my university. I spent a year working in the States and then still, for whatever reason, kept coming back to the idea of doing something abroad, and really liked the ideas that WorldTeach had talked about when I had previously been familiar with them. So decided to come here. I'm on month, I believe it's 8 now, maybe on my 9th month here. So I'm actually finishing my service pretty soon. But yeah, so I've been here for 8-9 months, can answer as many questions as possible about teaching in general, Ecuador in general, but I am based in Quito, so I am in a city as opposed to a provincial.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Genevieve. And I'm a Notre Dame alum as well. Actually, I didn't know that about you, so it's good to learn that. And it's, I'm thinking it's possible that you may have met me at that postgrad service fair. So that's kind of a
I don't know.
Awesome. Very cool. All right. Well, let's move on next to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, just kind of broadly, can you describe your background and your history with WorldTeach?
Everyone, my name is Elizabeth, and I first came to WorldTeach as a year program volunteer in September of 2015. I had just graduated from the University of California at Berkeley with a degree in history, emphasis on Latin American history, and just a couple classes short of a Spanish minor. And I knew my senior year that I wanted to dedicate my first year after college to a year of service. And I thought WorldTeach was a great way to have that chance to do that service work and also to deepen my knowledge and understanding of Latin America, which I had studied all through college, and I was really excited to get to live it as a volunteer. So I completed the year program in July, late July, early August of 2016, And I loved my experience so much that I returned to staff in the capacity of assistant field director in November of 2016, so just a few months after I finished service. And I've been here ever since.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm really excited about tonight's panel because it's not every day that we get to have a current volunteer and a member of field staff join our webinars. So it's great to have you ladies here. Thanks so much for joining us. Awesome. And thank you both as well for sharing more information about your backgrounds. I think it's really helpful for attendees to hear not only your role with WorldTeach and your experience in the program, but also kind of what led you to participating in the program to begin with. Great. And with that, let's dive right into the program. So every WorldTeach program starts with an orientation, and for year-long programs, that orientation is about 3 to 4 weeks, usually falls right at about 3.5 weeks. And Elizabeth, let's have you start with discussing some orientation basics. So some of the questions that you might answer for us are, where do volunteers stay during orientation, and what do they do? And what would you say are 2 to 3 of the most important topics that the cohort learns during orientation?
Wonderful. Yes, orientation is a really exciting time for both volunteers and staff because staff prepares for your arrival for months before you all come to country. So orientation is a wonderful and exciting time. Volunteers spend one night at a hostel upon arriving, and then we place all volunteers with host families for the duration of orientation. All volunteers are required to stay with host families for a little over 2 months, and that includes the entire duration of orientation. So volunteers live with their host families in Quito, and if they stay in Quito, that would be the same host family they would live with during their service. And for volunteers placed outside of Quito, they have an orientation host family in Quito and then their longer-term host family in their site. So orientation is really exciting, like I said, but also really intense. So we generally have days that run from 9 to 5, full with really important information that will help prepare you all for your service. So I like to say that orientation is intense and informative. So the biggest elements of orientation are ESL training. So staff works really hard to prepare you all for your classroom experiences teaching English through about 40 hours of teacher training. So from sessions on how to give directions to how to lesson plan to your actual practicum where you get to practice teaching in front of your peers is a huge component of orientation. Additionally, we also provide information on health and safety, so very in-depth information on how to stay healthy and safe in Ecuador. Finally, we have cultural trainings that allow volunteers to become acquainted with some typical aspects of Ecuadorian culture, as well as language support, so through Spanish classes.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Very comprehensive. And Genevieve, what would you say were some of the main benefits of orientation?
Yeah, so I am very, very thankful that we had an orientation before actually diving into teaching. So my background is not in teaching. I was in electrical engineering and then Spanish language and literature major in college, which is very different than teaching EFL or ESL, depending on who you're talking to. But so what I loved about orientation was I felt very prepared after orientation to handle a classroom, not only to teach the literal material of, English grammar, but also, how to structure a lesson plan, how to set expectations for your class, how to, have a good rapport with your students. All of that was covered in orientation, which I really appreciated because I was nervous coming in. I was excited about the challenge, but I really didn't know much about actual teaching until I got here. And so it was very nice to have a month-long period where I was able to kind of refine those skills. And one of the main things that I think before you come here, WorldTeach does a good job of saying, your main requirement is that you're a native English speaker and we can teach you the rest. And I definitely agree with that. I felt very prepared going into teaching after having doing the 3 to 4 week orientation.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Genevieve. And I'll tack another question onto that. Was there anything that surprised you? That's a little bit broad, but maybe in those first 3 to 4 weeks, anything that surprised you about either Ecuador itself, or teaching or WorldTeach? And so kind of you can take it any direction if that you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think everything sort of surprised me. I mean, it's no big surprise. You know, you're living with a host family. You are doing very long days for orientation. You're learning a bunch of stuff. You're in a new country. You're speaking Spanish when you're not in the classroom. So there are a lot of changes happening during that first month. What I was surprised with, I think I was nervous about that first one, just because there are so many changes and that can be really intimidating. But one thing that was really nice and a very good surprise was that I felt very supported both by staff as well as the other members of my cohort, who are all also going through the exact same thing as you. So despite sometimes being a little bit, surprised or confused about what's going on in your day-to-day, you definitely feel supported during such a big time of change and moving to a new country.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And when you're undergoing such a different experience, then that's when it's really helpful to have that support group behind you. So I'm so glad to hear that you saw that as a really positive experience. Awesome. And I think either of you should feel free to answer this question. This is something people ask us about a lot in the office. Would you say, is there anything volunteers should bring or prepare for beforehand, before the program begins and orientation starts? And again, either of you, if you feel you have an answer, feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Well, Field Staff does send out a pretty comprehensive packing list. I would say the most important preparation that volunteers can do for their service is to actually study Spanish, especially for volunteers who come with a more beginner level of Spanish. It can be more difficult to navigate and connect with your host family, and that's not to say that it's impossible, because we have volunteers who come in with almost no Spanish and have a wonderful experience. But I would say that understanding some Spanish and being able to communicate a bit really enhances the volunteer experience and definitely makes that transition easier. So definitely plan on studying Spanish a bit coming.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You cut out a little bit at the end there, but I think you were reiterating what you'd already very eloquently said, just that it is really helpful to have at least a little bit coming in. But I'll echo Elizabeth, and I personally lived abroad in South America for a few years as well. And in that time, I saw a lot of different levels of Spanish coming into the countries I lived in, and that same person, a very different level leaving. It's really incredible what you can learn in a short amount of time if you are putting the socialization and conversation and studying time in. So I think it's, even if you know only a little bit right now, don't despair. There's so many opportunities for learning just in living your daily life in Ecuador. So awesome. Thank you, ladies. And I think what we'll do now is move on to the next topic. And after orientation, volunteers are ready to head off to their placements. So we'll start with Genevieve and have her share some insights about her community, and then we'll have Elizabeth talk a little bit about placements in general. So Genevieve, my first question for you is, what is your living situation like? What's the housing, the accommodations like? What's the commute like? What's the community like? Tell us everything.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when you first get here, you are placed with a host family. I got placed with an amazing host family, a very cute lady named Soko, who was just very, very comforting and nice, sort of like having a mom around, which is definitely nice when you are adjusting to a new place. It's nice to be able to come home. So when you are placed with a host family, you have your bedroom. You also obviously have a bathroom available to you. Everyone kind of is placed in various places because of the fact that obviously there are many families for each person. But generally speaking, most people have mostly positive experiences with their host families. In terms of the community, so your host family becomes sort of like your family away from home. I mean, I did call like my host mom sometimes because of that. I also had a host brother that I would call brother. And in that regard, it's very nice to have them around because you have that support system. So when you're coming home and you have a bad day, you can kind of, say something to your host mom and she'll, give you a little pat on the back and can be very comforting, which I really appreciated. In addition to that, your cohort can sort of act as an additional community. So I live in Quito, which is definitely a specific experience, which can change based on where you are placed within Ecuador. But we live in a very large city. So for me, my commute from my host family's house was on a bus every day, there and back. And I actually lived a little bit further out, so my commute was a little bit longer than the majority of other members of my cohort that lived with host families. And after a certain amount of time with your host family, you do have the option to move out. So I actually took advantage of that just because my commute ended up being pretty long and a good chunk of my day. So I now live very, very close to school, which I was able to find equivalent housing through an expats group. So I currently live with a group of expats, 2 Venezuelans and a Frenchman, which is a totally different community, but also very fun and very interesting. We speak Spanish in the house, still that idea of kind of having a family away from your family. Which I've liked both experiences. It has worked out for me. Some people choose to stay with their host families the entire time because it works really well. Others decide to move out. And I honestly think both are very valuable experiences. I don't think you can go wrong either way.
That's awesome. Thanks, Genevieve. I agree. We really see a variety of what people decide to do, either to move out or to stay with their host families. And Genevieve, you might agree with this, but I often hear people say that even if they chose to move out, they still really feel like their host family is a source of support as well, and someone that they can either eat dinner with or visit with or have another kind of support layer to rely on.
Yeah, so yes, like I said, I lived with this adorable little lady named Soco or Socorito, and I still occasionally go over there and have dinner, and I bring her flowers, and we just chat about, what's going on, the chisme, all that stuff, because she loves to just chat and figure out what's going on in life. But yeah, they're still very much a support family. Like when I leave, I will 100% go over for a goodbye dinner. Still definitely had a positive experience.
That's awesome. Great. And what I really liked about your comments is just how many different layers of community you have there in this country, where you had even said, you were nervous about going to begin with, which rightfully so. It's scary to move to a totally new country, new culture, new language, new profession, everything. So it's great for me to hear how many different layers of community you've built for yourself there. Awesome. And I would ask another question too. I'm sure people have this on their minds. What is your typical diet like, or what are some of your favorite foods in Ecuador?
Yeah, so if you live with a host family, you are provided 2 meals a day, typically breakfast and dinner, which is very, very nice, especially the first month when you're tired and you don't really know which way is up and everything with orientation. It's very nice to have meals provided to you. So Ecuadorian culture in general is a little bit different with the way their meals work, the meals that are stressed. So almuerzo or lunch is the biggest meal of the day, and typically I eat that out. And even when you're with a host family, you'll have lunch out. But you can get an entire almuerzo, which is soup, and a main dish, which has rice and meat and salad, and sometimes even a dessert and juice, all of that for like $3, which is very, very affordable, which is nice. And I personally love almuerzo. I think it's delicious. It's a very good, sturdy meal. And when you have such a big lunch, you don't need to necessarily have as large of other meals. Depending on what you get served in your host family, it can vary based on who your host family is. My host family was also very accommodating. If I mentioned, I specifically only eat this type of stuff, they definitely would have accommodated. I personally don't have any major dietary restrictions. I pretty much eat anything that's put in front of me. So I pretty much just ate what was given to me, which was always very interesting. Generally speaking, you'll probably pretty much have rice, beans, and meat for every meal in some way, shape, or form. But the way that that's presented, what you get is totally, totally varied, which is really cool. But overall, I loved the food. There's some stuff that I'm really sad to leave. There's certain fruits here that we don't have in the States. My favorite dish is called cevichocho. It uses this like specific type of bean, chocho beans that they don't have here, or they don't have in the States, which I'm very sad to leave. But overall, I've loved the food, and I will definitely miss it. In general, like they don't use as many preservatives. It's much fresher, which I really appreciate. So even when you like have a massive lunch, you don't get that like tired, gross feeling that I feel like you get in the States when you eat something that has major preservatives in it. So I have loved the food. I have all good things to say.
Those were raving reviews. Thank you so much, Genevieve. I really echo them, especially about the produce that you can get in Ecuador. One of my overwhelming memories from my time in South America, but especially in Quito, is just walking into the produce markets and seeing just a literal wall of bananas, every kind of banana you could possibly imagine. I didn't know there were that many kinds of bananas, and every type of fruits that you could imagine, and all of it was so tasty, and the juice that they made from it was incredible as well. So if I could recreate any meals from Ecuador, it would involve all the fresh fruit that you can get there. Awesome. So Elizabeth, now I'll ask you if you could talk a little bit more generally about placements. What are some basic resources that all volunteers will have in their community? And what are a couple of relatively modern conveniences that they may not have access to that people should be prepared for?
Absolutely. So some general resources that all volunteers have access to would be internet. So a lot of our host families have Wi-Fi at home, so many volunteers are able to use Wi-Fi in their homes, and for those who don't have it's not an issue because there are many, many internet cafes available in cities throughout Ecuador where volunteers are able to connect to the internet. So that's one convenience that is very easily accessible. In terms of resources for your classes, copies are also easy to make. Generally speaking, our partners give volunteers a set amount of copies that they are able to utilize during their teaching cycles. And if volunteers choose to make more than that, that would be on their own dime, but it's very affordable to make copies. It's generally about 2 to 3 cents per copy. And also in terms of classroom resources, all volunteers have access to teaching resources, so a curriculum, sometimes web pages, CDs that accompany their books, stuff like that. And in terms of what might be less available, Ecuador is actually pretty developed, but I would say that sometimes hot water and Wi-Fi can be less dependable. So, especially for provincial placements, sometimes the hot water goes out, sometimes the internet goes out, and you might find yourself needing to boil some water for a shower once in a while. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but it can be a little bit more less, like I said, less dependable than we might be used to. But in general, quite a few things in Ecuador, especially in Quito, like for example, a lot of Americans, we love our peanut butter, and we're worried that, oh, we won't be able to find peanut butter. But actually, particularly for those who like natural peanut butter, Ecuador has incredibly cheap natural peanut butter available all over the place. So there's a lot of things that you can find here. The one thing that I would also say is that in terms of electronics, because of Ecuador's high import tax, electronics in Ecuador are very expensive. They're usually like twice as much as they are in the States, so that's one thing to keep in mind. It's not that they're not available, but they are.
Oh, I think you might have cut out a little bit there, Elizabeth, but thank you so much. That was a very detailed explanation, and hopefully it helps people prepare. And you actually caught upon a topic I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about. So you mentioned provincial placements, and we know Genevieve is in a more urban placement. Can you talk a little bit, just brief explanation about the differences between types of placements?
Sure. So currently we only have volunteers in Quito, and Quito volunteers live in the capital city, which is definitely a different experience from living in a provincial city or a smaller. But our placements can vary based on the cohort and based on what contracts we have at different universities. So a provincial placement, past couple of years, we've had some provincial placements in Andean cities, such as Riobamba, Ambato, Ibarra, and the like. And those kinds of placements are a wonderful opportunity as well, and definitely a little bit of a different experience from in Quito. As you can imagine, in Quito, there are a lot of expats and a lot of events going on, a lot of nightlife, a lot of opportunity for Spanish classes, a lot of opportunity for travel, etc. Whereas in provincial placements, you might get more of the local feel in places where there aren't as many foreigners, in places where maybe your students have only ever really lived in and grown up in that one provincial city their whole lives. So it's definitely a different experience and wonderful as well. Caitlin, do you have specific aspects that you'd like me to talk about with regards to the different types of placements?
No, I think that was really an excellent kind of overview of what's available. So thank you so much for providing that. And there is one more question that I have for you, Elizabeth. So is there anything you'd like to address about safety in communities?
So safety is often a very big concern for participants and their family and friends alike. Moving to a new country can be scary, and depending on where you are, it's more or less safe. So Quito, like any large city anywhere in the world, has higher safety risks than smaller cities. So volunteers in Quito have to be extra careful with regards to their safety, particularly when it comes to petty theft. Our biggest safety concern in the city is definitely pickpocketing on public transportation. So a lot of times volunteers won't even notice their bag. Those kinds of petty thefts are very common. So volunteers have to be very alert to their surroundings and paying very close attention, particularly in Quito. Not that volunteers in provincial sites can let down their guard entirely, but it's definitely of utmost importance in cities to be very cautious. And field staff provides extremely in-depth health and safety training to all volunteers during orientation. And in fact, in the most recent orientation that we hosted, we actually had a safety and security officer from the U.S. Embassy come talk to our volunteers about safety concerns in Ecuador and how to best protect themselves. So it's definitely a concern, but definitely manageable through training and caution and exercising good sense.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. That was a really comprehensive overview of placements and concerns and questions that you might have about the communities that we place volunteers into. Excellent. So thank you both so much for those insights. And we'll spend some time now talking about the best ways to fully integrate into your new home and adapt to this new culture. And we'll start with you, Genevieve, by asking, how are you involved, or did you get involved in your community? How do you spend your free time, for example, weekends?
Yeah, so because I live in Quito, there is a lot of stuff going on very often that allows for a lot of awesome opportunities to get involved in a variety of communities. So a major part of something that I was interested in, I'm a pretty athletic person. I like to work out and do sort of activities related to that. So one thing that I was able to get involved in very quickly was a soccer team. So I originally joined a soccer team for the university that I worked at, or that I work at. And got to meet a lot of different people from outside of just English teachers, which was really cool, like actual, Ecuadorian women that were also on the team. That was fun. And then that actually opened a door. And now I regularly, each week have I don't want to call it a league, but basically a pickup soccer group where we go and we play soccer once a week at the big park in Quito, Parque Carolina. Which I have loved, and those people that I've met through that are a variety of both local Ecuadorians as well as other expats from all over the world. And I've hung out with them from there on weekends and stuff like that, so that's been a really awesome opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah. Awesome.
Sorry, I cut out for a sec.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
So in addition to that, so that was a huge part for me. I also joined a gym here, which is nice. The gym that I joined is very nice. They're always very nice to me when I wave and say hello, which is nice. In addition to that, so specifically in terms of Ecuadorian culture, one thing that I found that has been very interesting is because I teach, the level of student that I teach is actually right around like university aged. After finishing teaching, I have had some students that have expressed interest in continuing to like be friends. So I have met a variety of Ecuadorians through that, which has been very cool. They've taken me to like various concerts that happen in Quito or various events. That's been really cool as well. But I think the biggest thing to really think about is the fact that you're living here for 10 months. And so you really want to create a life that you enjoy. And so, for example, you definitely have to adjust and you have to be open to adjusting. But if there's something that you're really passionate about, like soccer, for example, like that doesn't just go away, even though you live here. You can find communities for that here. And that's what I found really helped me immerse myself and really enjoy it, is I thought about the things that I wanted to do and found people here that also shared in that. And it's just an awesome cultural exchange because you have this common interest, but you also come from wildly different backgrounds. And that helped me assimilate the best. I did come here with fairly high Spanish proficiency, but my Spanish proficiency has also gotten so much better just because of the opportunities like that. Because obviously you're not using it in class when you're speaking English, but you are using it almost any time you're out doing an activity of any sort. And just like the vocab, like I never thought of how to communicate with someone on a soccer field using Spanish, but now I know how to do that. So that's something that I definitely encourage people. You know, I know people from my cohort like have enjoyed yoga or they like art classes, you know, like that interest doesn't go away. So your life doesn't go on hold while you're here. You really want to assimilate, and to do that, just think about those things that you enjoy doing and find a community here. And that is definitely possible. And maybe it changes and adapts depending on what city you actually are in, whether in Quito, which is very large, or even a smaller one. But to some extent, any sort of community that appreciates cooking or something exists. You just have to kind of search for it and find it.
That's great, Genevieve. Such a wonderful thing to have people keep it in mind, and it rings really true with my own experiences. I'm a really big hiker. I really love being in the outdoors, and I do that here all the time. And in South America, it was really awesome to find groups of people that were similarly into that activity. And then you had these incredible outdoor adventures you could have in Ecuador, even just within Quito. I believe there are 2 volcanoes within city limits, some that you can get to via public transportation and just go hiking. So it's really an amazing opportunity to take things you love and build a community doing those things in the new place as well, and be exposed to how people do those things there. So awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And then Genevieve, you might, if you feel you've already answered this question, let me know, but would you say there's anything that you or that other volunteers should know about Ecuadorian culture specifically that would kind of enable volunteers to maximize their immersion in their community? Oh, Genevieve, can you hear me?
Unmute. Oh. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good. Gotcha.
Sorry, my button wasn't unmuting me. Oh. So I don't know why. Nice. So just to make sure I heard you correctly, so things about Ecuadorian culture that will help to assimilate?
Yeah, anything that you found kind of specific to the culture, the local culture, that helped you assimilate or helped you maximize your immersion into the community?
Yeah, so I think above all, and this is pretty much true for anyone that decides to move to a new culture in a new country, you have to come in with a very open mind to people that have different views, and you also have to be a little bit willing to adapt. I mean, it's not like, oh, you're changing who you are, but there are certain things that are different, and you have to acknowledge and respect those differences. Specific to Ecuador, so Ecuadorians are very, very friendly. I've never had a lot of hostility or anything from Ecuadorians. That being said, they are a little bit more reserved, a little bit not necessarily as like in your face hello. So one thing that can be sort of an adjustment, like for example, very much so like a thing or stereotype, I guess we'll call it, of like people from the United States is tend to be like they talk very loudly. And if you're in a restaurant, they're talking very loudly. You'll notice when you come to Ecuador, like the volume level of conversation in a restaurant is just much lower. And that's something that I've noticed I've definitely adjusted to. And so now if I'm in a place and I hear someone talking very loudly, I'll be like, oh my goodness, it sounds so different, right? So just those little cultural things that you do have to respect to a certain extent, especially if you want to assimilate as well as you can. But overall, and especially because Quito is a large city with a lot of diverse population, people are very willing and open to understand your culture. But that also kind of, it's a two-way street. So Ecuadorians, they do tend to talk a little bit softer. They're very nice people. They enjoy when you are polite to them. When you enter a room in Ecuador, you need to greet every single person in the room. That's something different. The greeting will be a kiss on the cheek. That is different. But it is very much considered a sign of respect. And at first, it definitely feels a little strange because it's not necessarily a cultural custom for where I'm from, but you adjust very quickly once you kind of open yourself to like, okay, I'm in a new culture, I want to embrace this. Things like that just start to happen more naturally.
Great, Genevieve. Thank you. Those really are just very insightful. And I remember the volume of conversations very well and adjusting to that. And then another thing that I've seen people do a lot is how loudly you close doors or close car doors. I don't know if you've run into
Definitely,
that. Yeah. That one. And that
taxi
one.
drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, taxi drivers sometimes will, like, before, if you get in and they know you're a foreigner, they'll say, hey, like, can you make sure you close the door gently when you get out? Like, they'll remind you. Just because that is definitely a thing. Like, for them, if you slam the door, it's a very much a lack of respect. So it's just little things like that, which you kind of absorb and learn as you're going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny to hear that you've had that experience as well, because I can echo that exactly. And you might not know, and people might correct you, and it's just really important to take that advice to heart and kind of, if you can, adjust your behavior to kind of fit in with what people might prefer there to help them feel more comfortable. Great. So what we'll do now, just to keep the webinar moving along, is we'll talk a little bit about the classroom. And of course, the reason we're all headed to Ecuador to begin with is to teach. And I know from my own time spent teaching abroad that the impact of my students and my school and my experience was immeasurable. It completely made my experience, and I have so many fond memories of my time as a teacher in my community. So we're back to you, Genevieve. So I'll ask you some questions about the following. What is your day-to-day teaching schedule at the school, and what sorts of resources do you have in the classroom?
So my day-to-day teaching schedule has shifted a little bit between cycles. So I teach in 8-week cycles. My current teaching schedule is from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. each day. I teach two-hour classes, 5 days a week, so Monday through Friday. I teach in a building that has no technology. So I have a board and expo markers and desks and chairs. So I do not have any technology. I personally have enjoyed that challenge because I think when you rely on technology, there's a lot that can go wrong. Like the projector's not working, the computer doesn't connect, something like that. So I've definitely had to be creative in the ways that I have formed my lessons to make sure that it is basically dependent on pieces of paper and, me talking and getting my students to follow directions. But it's been a good challenge. I do have access to copies, although the copier doesn't always work. So that's another thing, like make sure you're adaptable to changing that. But that's all stuff you'll learn in orientation, like how to change a lesson if something goes against your original plan. So I teach two-hour classes a day, so 4 hours a day with the same students. It is only 8 weeks long, so you are getting new students very often, but you'll notice that spending 10 hours a week with the same group of people, you do form bonds really quickly, and you are able to connect with your students and get to know your students quite quickly because of that.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Genevieve. And are there any sort of cultural challenges that you feel you've encountered in the classroom? And this could be cultural challenges in the classroom in Ecuador or maybe specific to your school.
Yeah, so as I've mentioned a few times now, it's definitely different moving to a new place. There's just different cultural norms, different expectations for how things work. There are definitely cultural challenges at times. I have found that I overall have had amazing experiences with my students. I have connected very well with them. I have a very open relationship with them, meaning I make sure that they know that I'm there to support them. So that has worked to my advantage, where my students definitely feel comfortable coming and talking to me if they're not understanding something. But that being said, there are certain just differences in, for example, being on time to class. Like, being on time here is a different standard than we're used to in the States, especially because like I worked in corporate America for some time. Like, being on time there is being 5 minutes early. Being on time here is like walking in within the first 15 minutes of class. That can be an adjustment. That's something you have to sort of get to. Cultural challenges in general, like, you know, the topics that you give examples for, like you might want to talk about, I don't know, some random US cultural thing, and you bring it up and no one knows what you're talking about because they don't have the same cultural thing. So I oftentimes bring in examples that I have found or know of from Latin American culture, from Ecuadorian culture, because they're able to relate to it a lot better. Sort of a funny stereotype, I guess, is that very often in the US, people assume that if you're Latin American, that you love reggaeton music. And Ecuadorians in particular really do not actually enjoy reggaeton. It's not very popular. They much more prefer like bachata or salsa music, or just a wide variety of, you know, English speaking music as well. So I jokingly kind of have this ongoing thing with my students where I talk about like Shakira and Maluma all the time, because they're very well-known figures and they know what they know who the cultural reference is. But it's not something where you can come in and be like, oh yeah, well, you all love this, right? Like, no, not necessarily. You have to ask that. That's part of asking them. So I actually, at the beginning of each of my cycles, I have my students fill out a survey where they tell me like, this is what I studied in school. This is my current job. This is things that I like to talk about. And then I look at those topics and incorporate them into the lessons to make sure that I'm talking about things that culturally are relevant for them and that they're actually interested in. Because if you come in and you talk about like, I don't know, deep dish pizza, which is like, I'm from Chicago. Like, if I just talked to them about deep dish pizza, they would have no idea what I was talking about. So that's a huge thing to balance well. Because sometimes they like hearing about it, but if you talk about it too much, they just won't be able to connect and the lesson will kind of lose their interest.
That's awesome, Genevieve. Thank you for not only sharing the challenge, but also how you deal with it. And I think that's so cool that you're gathering that knowledge from your students and using it to inform your lessons. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing. And Elizabeth, you as a former volunteer and also field staff, you have your own experiences in the classroom with cultural challenges and so on. But I'm imagining you hear from all volunteers about a variety of challenges they're experiencing in the classroom. So maybe I'll throw that same question at you. Are there any kind of common cultural or otherwise challenges that you find people encounter?
Yes, definitely. I think a couple of the big ones that I noticed myself as a teacher and also with volunteers as their supervisor is cheating. So the idea of cheating is definitely a little bit different here. Sharing your homework with another student might not be considered cheating to those students, whereas for us, from our perspective, if you give your completed homework assignment to a friend to have them copy it, that would definitely be cheating. So things like that. I remember one time I assigned an oral exam that was for students to speak about their personal heroes. And I had a couple of students read off articles that they had pulled from the internet, and I could tell as soon as they said 2 sentences that they hadn't written it. And despite like having talked about, well, what is plagiarism and like how should this assignment be completed, I still got a few of those things happening. So that can definitely be a challenge and can be frustrating for especially for new teachers, as you come into the classroom, super excited about teaching your students and having them learn and participate, to have blatant cheating going on. And so when that happened with me, how I addressed it was I called them out on it and gave them a second chance. So I'd say, you're not going to be able to get 100% on this assignment, even if you do really well. You're going to lose some credit for cheating in the first place, but I will give you a second chance to get lesser credit, but so you can still get some kind of credit on this. And just kind of re-explaining, like, what is cheating? As Genevieve mentioned, definitely the time issue can be challenging for those of us who come from the early is on time culture. And then also sometimes teachers can struggle to get their students to complete homework. Some of our teachers end up instructing students who have very busy lives. Perhaps they're university students who also have internships, who are taking intense engineering courses and don't have as much time to dedicate to English as we might hope. Or perhaps they're community members who have 2 children and work a job from 9 to 5 and they study from 6 to 8. So it can be sometimes a challenge to motivate students to do homework. And especially for those of us who come from language classes in the United States, where homework was an integral part of the language learning experience, it can be frustrating. So one way to deal with that is to incentivize your students with rewards. We always prefer the carrot to the stick in terms of making students want to complete the homework as opposed to punishing them for not completing it. So yeah, those are, I think, some of the biggest challenges that you might encounter in a classroom in Ecuador.
Those are great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And I really like how you put the focus on incentivizing students as well. I think that's important in any culture. Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing those experiences with us. And while this title, "The Year is Almost Over," is a little facetious, I think that both of you might agree with me about how fast this year can go. And while it's tough to try to sum up such a transformative year in a few words, I'm just going to ask our panelists a few questions about how their experience in Ecuador is impacting or has impacted them. So feel free, Genevieve or Elizabeth, to answer any of these questions. I think the first one we'll ask is, what would you say are some of the most vital skills or perspectives that you've taken away so far from your experiences in Ecuador?
So for me, I think above all, one of the most valuable things that I've learned is just how to really live in a new culture and be surrounded by people that do not have some in a new state. You can feel that a little bit, but it really takes a lot once you are out in a new country, people with different backgrounds and relating to them. So a huge skill that I've learned is just kind of cultural competency, cultural fluency, how to relate to people, how to connect with people. I mean, at the end of the day, we all definitely are humans, and I have found like I'm able to connect to people because we're able to laugh about things and we're able to connect on a human level, but that does take a little bit of refining to make sure that you're doing that in a way that is, respectful and just values the other person. And I think overall, just like a perspective change. I've just really enjoyed living in a totally new place. I think it's very, very helpful to live in a place that's outside of your comfort zone. You definitely have to come here with an open mind because things will not be the same as they are where you're from. But that's a really good thing. And you become really, really adaptable very easily. Or you realize how unadaptable you are, and then you are forced to change. Which I have found that's a just really valuable thing. Like, I feel like I'm much more confident now going into almost any situation and feeling like, okay, yeah, I could handle this. And that is it's a really valuable skill that I think I can take pretty much anywhere moving forward.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, Genevieve. Thank you. Elizabeth, would you have anything you'd want to add on to that question?
Definitely. I would say there are a couple different ways you can answer that question. What ways can volunteers grow professionally, and what ways can they grow in terms of life skills and personally? So for me, I definitely learned on the professional side how to become a better facilitator, how to teach. I came into the program as a volunteer, having worked in educational settings, but more in tutoring settings as opposed to teaching. So learning how to command a classroom with respect, with cultural competency, with kindness, and with dedication. That was definitely a really wonderful skill that I developed professionally, as well as Spanish skills, particularly in my capacity as field staff. I really honed my professional Spanish skills. And as a volunteer as well, I learned how to communicate in Spanish and using culturally appropriate language in my communications. So for example, it's kind of fun in Ecuador. A lot of the times Ecuadorian people are a little less direct than Americans are. So learning how to say things in an Ecuadorian way in Spanish is kind of fun because you kind of go around the point a little bit before you get to it. And so that's a fun little life skill to have. Additionally, as something I learned as both a volunteer and field staff is really to be flexible. So things in Ecuador often don't go as planned. So learning how to make adjustments on the go, how to improvise, how to make things work when plans fall through is a skill that is invaluable in any area that volunteers choose to pursue following their service. So our motto in Ecuador is flow like water, which one of our September volunteers nicely changed to flow like H2O. Sounds a little better. And I think it's truly important in Ecuador, and something that any WorldTeach Ecuador participant will learn is how to be truly flexible and to relax a little bit more, and to just accept that things are not going to be exactly as you expect them, and learn how to make adaptations as necessary.
Very inspiring. Thanks, Elizabeth. I like that modification, flow like H2O. I like it. I've heard flow like water before, but I think the rhyme really kicks it up another level.
Yep.
Great. Well, so as a final question, before we open it up to Q&A, and I discuss just a few logistics about the application process and so on, can either of you tell me about a favorite memory that you have from your time so far in Ecuador?
So for me, I think, so my birthday was in September, the end of September, and I didn't tell my students when my birthday was. I had mentioned very briefly in my introduction on the very first day of class back in August, that I had a birthday at the end of September, and they figured out when my birthday was, and they organized this like massive happy birthday thing where they came into class together and they sang me happy birthday, and they bought me a huge cake, and then they nominated one of the students to give a speech that he prepared about their appreciation for me as a teacher, and their enjoyment. And I'm like not a very emotional person, but I was like tearing up in class because at the end of the day, you know, you're trying to teach them grammar, and I really stress this to my students, like, yeah, it's great if you learn grammar, but the bottom line is we don't care if you really know, like, past perfect, whatever. Like, all that's really important is that you're able to communicate, and that's the biggest thing. Like, you're learning English so you can communicate. And so for me, for them to be able to communicate, like, such nice things to me as a teacher really made me feel like they were really understanding what I was trying to get to. And it was like a very big moment because it just felt, you know, like, okay, this matters. Like, this had an impact on them, even if they forgot me, like, you know, the second I wasn't their teacher anymore. For that time being, it was very impactful that, okay, like I made a difference in their English. They all appreciate English more because of the way that I taught it. That was a huge, huge thing. And I'm not emotional. I was like crying. They gave me a gift, and they, you know, all gave me hugs. And I was like, thanks, guys. It was very nice.
That's so sweet. It's, you know, sometimes speaking as a former teacher, and actually a still current teacher, on the side, it really can feel few and far between sometimes, where you feel that you can see the impact that you've made, and to have such an awesome experience where the students are directly telling you, this has been your impact on me. I'm sure it's just so memorable. And that's really, you have the sweetest students. Thanks for sharing that, Genevieve. How about you, Elizabeth? Do you have a favorite memory from Ecuador?
Yeah, of course. I have a few. For my classroom experience, I would definitely say my third cycle of teaching out of 4. I had my favorite class. They were all just a few years older than I was, and I really connected with them in the class through teaching, through activities and whatnot. And we would have English hours after class. So we'd finish class at 8 and we'd go to a coffee shop and just chat about whatever they wanted to talk about for an hour. And it was super nice. It was a wonderful way to get to know my students better and to allow them to practice their English in more speaking, oral English and listening comprehension. And it just felt like a really special way to bond with my students. So that was my favorite classroom memory. I know a lot of you probably love to travel as well, or are interested in traveling a bit, and Ecuador is fantastic for traveling. As a volunteer, I traveled every few weekends. The buses are super accessible and very affordable. You can take a bus basically anywhere in the country. And so I would travel a lot with my fellow cohort members. As field staff, I don't travel so much because I have an emergency phone, but as a volunteer, I definitely took full advantage of my vacation time as well as my weekends. And finally, I met my husband while teaching. He was also a teacher at my university, so definitely falling in love with an Ecuadorian and learning about Ecuadorian culture through a relationship really enhanced my experience overall in Ecuador, and it's been very positive.
You saved a great story for last, Elizabeth. That one's really good. I was like, how's anyone going to top Genevieve's? It's so sweet, but you had a pretty good trump card in there. That's awesome. Yeah, it's really great to hear just the impact that not only you guys feel you have made, but that this experience has made on you. And it's just very inspiring to hear those stories straight from the source. So thank you guys so much for sharing. Well, so what we'll do quickly before opening up to a final Q&A session is discuss a few of the logistics. So the first logistic I'd like to go over is the application process and requirements to apply. So participants in the WorldTeach Ecuador Year program should be a native level English speaker and have earned your bachelor's degree by the time of departure. And then throughout your application materials, what you'll really want to demonstrate is that you feel you can be in a position to be flexible, mature when taking on the classroom duties, and have an interest in global engagement, education, and intercultural learning. Those are all qualities that are really important throughout our mission, and it's something we look for in materials. Speaking of materials, you would submit a resume and a personal statement, as well as one reference, and then you finish up with an interview with a member of our staff. And you can begin or complete your application at worldteach.org/apply. And you can also feel free if you have any questions about logistics or about the program itself, feel free to email us at admissions@worldteach.org. I would definitely urge you to look into potentially earning your TEFL certification while you are abroad in Ecuador with us. I really think that it is such a valuable certification to have on your resume, and it really will be an amazing sort of resource to support you as you're moving through your year. So I would definitely recommend looking more into that. And then in terms of the deadline, the applications for the Ecuador year February 2019 departure will be accepted on a rolling basis until December 1st, 2018. And then the decision is made within 2 weeks after you completed your application. So that could be 1 to 2 weeks, but definitely within 2 weeks. And then this is all very publicly available on the website, so I definitely encourage you to take a close look at the website as well. And again, email us with any questions that you might have. But just to go over logistics for fees, your contribution to the Ecuador program is $2,990, and that goes towards a up to $2,500 housing stipend that you would earn by successful completion of the program, as well as a living stipend of the same amount. Orientation, which was discussed in depth in this webinar, but then we also have 2 other professional conferences, a mid-service and an end-to-service conference, as well as pre-departure preparation and visa assistance if necessary. And then please note that brief information about the visa fee that is down at the bottom. That's something to keep in mind when you're planning out your finances. As well as Elizabeth mentioned the emergency phone. So the emergency phone refers to the 24-hour in-country field staff support. And that is, it would be available to call that emergency line if you did have an emergency at any hours. It's 24/7. So we would definitely want you to take advantage of that. Then there's supplemental overseas travel medical insurance, as well as access to teacher quality support program and alumni services. So please feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have about those logistics. Again, the email is admissions@worldteach.org. Awesome. Well, we've reached the portion for a Q&A session. So I'm going to let you guys listen in for a second and see if you guys have any questions that you want to throw our way. So one question that I'm seeing, so we discussed this a little bit, and of course it will be different between Quito and any more rural placements. But Genevieve, can you speak a little bit to public transportation in Quito? Is that something that you use often?
Yeah, so Quito has pretty great public transportation in terms of being able to get places. It does take a little bit of time because the traffic is pretty bad, but it's definitely accessible and it's very affordable. So anytime you get on a bus in Quito, no matter where you go, it's 25 cents a quarter.
Wow.
Which is very affordable. And there are a ton of bus routes. And they go all over the city, depending on where you're trying to go. I use public transit all the time, not as much. I used to use it very, very regularly because I lived, I had to take the bus to work. I now get to walk to work, but I still use the bus when I want to go to the park or to the mall or wherever I'm trying to go. Yeah, so it's 25 cents for every ride. Previously, it has been a little bit of a learning curve in terms of figuring out which buses to take and when to take, but actually in the past about 2 months, Quito has had major initiatives to improve that. So now in each bus stop, there's a massive map that has all of the buses that come to that stop and where they go, which is totally new and really, really helpful. But there's definitely options. They're actually also building a metro that is supposed to open at some point. I don't actually know when it's going to because I think it's delayed a lot. But yes, there's definitely public transit options, and they're very, very nice. And even if you're trying to get other places in Ecuador, the buses go. There are also buses that go. You know, you take a night bus and you go to Cuenca, or you go to Montanita, or there's a bunch of different options there. So definitely options for public transit, and it's very affordable.
That's great. Thanks so much, Genevieve. I remember public transit in Quito being a little intimidating as well, but really rewarding once you start to feel more comfortable with it. The one thing I personally remember is that you didn't necessarily have marked stops. Most people would just kind of let the bus driver know they needed to get off at a certain point. So if you're waiting for a particular stop, then you weren't always going to be able to get off there. I don't know if that's the same for you, Genevieve. Do people kind of just let the bus driver know whenever they need to get off, or has this revamping let them assign stop?
So actually it's interesting. So there was a time when you could literally there's a button that you press when you want to get off, and the bus driver would just literally stop wherever you pressed it. Now there are actually stops. The bus drivers are pretty strict about the stops. There are not necessarily marked, so you do kind of have to know where you are and know where you're going. But that's part of the learning curve. It is definitely difficult the first couple of days, but once you get used to the bus and you get used to it, you will understand how it works, and it is much easier once you kind of have that week or two where you're not exactly sure. But there's a button that you press, and the button alerts the driver that you're getting off at the next stop, and then they'll stop and you can get off.
Awesome. Very cool. And I will also put a plug in for, I traveled via bus. I'm a frequent bus traveler, but I have to say that traveling via bus in South America was an amazing way to go. Bus coverage is so extensive, and it was really affordable, and you got to see some pretty awesome sights while you were traveling. So I would frequently travel by bus, and I really enjoyed it. Great. And we have one other question coming in. So I think this is one I can take on. Just wondering if there are any semester Ecuador programs for 2019. I can let you guys know that there are not currently scheduled to be any semester programs in Ecuador. We actually are, I'll put in a plug for another program. We are actually sending a semester program to the Marshall Islands in January. So if any of you guys are interested in pretty different location than Ecuador, and are interested in leaving this January, then feel free to email us and we'd be happy to tell you more. And you can find out more information about the Marshals on our website. Semester programs tend to be in response to potentially requests for more teachers from the Ministry of Education that we're partnering with. So they might not have as much lead time in terms of having it be planned, because it might be kind of an addition to the year-long program that's already there, and it may have been kind of an extra request from that partner. So that's something that you definitely want to check our website for updates and be on our mailing list so we can let you know if any of those opportunities arise. And we do have, I know we're a little bit over the hour time, so if any of you attendees need to head out, then you're welcome to head out, and a recording of this webinar will be sent to you, so you'll still be able to hear the final questions. But if Genevieve and Elizabeth don't mind staying a little bit longer, I have a question from Kathy about holidays. So she's wondering, are there national holiday breaks, or are the breaks determined by each school? So either of you feel free to jump in on that.
Sure, I'll go ahead and take this. There are both national holidays that all volunteers will have off, as well as school-specific break schedules. So, for example, we actually just had a 4-day weekend here in Ecuador for Day of the Dead and a holiday celebrating Cuenca, which is a city in the southern part of Ecuador. So we just had last Thursday and Friday off, and volunteers at any site would have that 4-day weekend. However, when it comes to longer breaks, such as perhaps a Christmas break, we wouldn't call it winter here because Ecuador doesn't really have seasons, or a semester break or a cycle break, those are all dependent on the institutions we work at and if they work with semesters or if they work with cycles. So vacation time definitely does vary by site.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And we have another question. The question is, what kind of smartphone do you have? So either of you two could jump in and answer that. I'll just rep my own phone that I had when I lived in Ecuador. I will tell you this was quite a few years ago, but I had one of those prepay as you go phones that you could buy with $10 credit loaded up. So that was kind of nice for me to not have to worry about a smartphone or kind of keep my eye on it all the time. And to live kind of the simple life. But that was quite a few years ago, so I can see why a smartphone would be something you would definitely want to think about bringing and think about your plan regarding it. So how about you, Elizabeth or Genevieve? What kind of phone do you use, and are there any considerations that you would tell people considering bringing their phone to think about?
Yeah, so when you originally get here, you need to have some sort of Ecuadorian contact number for the purpose of field staff. So originally, it can definitely be tempting. So get like the brick phone, which is the pay-as-you-go. You can also do a pay-as-you-go with a smartphone, but so to get the basic brick phone, I will say that I have felt that living in Quito, because it's such a massive city, I definitely felt that I appreciated having a smartphone because pretty much anyone you meet will want to talk to you via WhatsApp, which is an app, not a text. So if you want to be kind of in the know of like what's going on with like my soccer group, all of those groups are in WhatsApp. So we can definitely feel disconnected if you don't have a WhatsApp number to be able to communicate people. And in addition to that, being that I live in a big city, like having a map available like via a smartphone, as well as the ability to call a cab at any time. I found that having a smartphone was very valuable. That being said, I do not have so I have an iPhone in the States. I did not, or I brought that phone here, but that stays in my house 100% of the time. I bought a cheaper, I think it's like an LG phone for like $110 or something, or $100. And that's the phone I use. So it's a smartphone. It has all the capabilities, but it's also not a $800 smartphone. It's much more basic. But I found that it works great. I actually really enjoy the phone. And because you do have to be sort of concerned about petty thefts, like getting it taken on the bus or something like that. If that $100 phone got taken, I wouldn't be as heartbroken as if an $800 phone got taken. So for me, that's worked the best. There are people that have, like iPhones and stuff, and that works for them. I just found that for me, I don't feel quite as nervous about having, such a valuable piece of technology out with me all the time, but I do feel safe and connected enough because I have access to call a cab if I need to contact my friends via WhatsApp. And it's a very affordable phone plan. Like, I pay a monthly one, but you can pay the thing where it's like $3 a week or whatever, pay as you go. You can do either of that, but it's very affordable, and I found it to be a great investment.
Awesome, Genevieve. Thanks. That's so much valuable information. And it makes me think of a question. Is Uber available yet in Quito?
So Uber does exist here. It's sort of in this weird gray area legally. So something that's different, like you have to sit in the front seat when you get in an Uber, which if you're comfortable with, it works. There's also an equivalent called Cabify that works similarly to Uber. Both of those work well, but in addition to that, they have apps that just allow you to call taxis. So a taxi will come and pick you up, but you call it via your phone. So you're able to call the taxi company or even order one on your phone and say, hey, I need a taxi at this location. So it's sort of a middle ground. It doesn't operate the exact same way, but it is getting more and more popular. Eventually, I think they will decide something. It's just sort of in this weird gray area right now because there aren't laws about it. Mm-hmm. So it exists and you can use it, and it's very reliable. I personally use Cabify. I don't use Uber, but I find it very useful and very safe. But you also have a cab option that you can call on your phone.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, ladies. And I think I'm not seeing any other questions, and we've run a few minutes over, so I think this is where I'll end. And I'd like to give a big round of applause to both of you guys for providing such detailed and nuanced perspectives of daily life in Ecuador and your time in the program. And it's especially nice to have perspective of both a current volunteer and someone who has been a volunteer and is currently field staff. So I can't thank you enough for both of you guys coming on. And to all the listeners, please, again, feel free to email us at admissions@worldteach.org. We're really helpful, we are very helpful, but we're also very eager to help you. So feel free to give us a call either at our office or send us an email. And again, the deadline for this program, the February departure, there is also a September departure, but the deadline for the February one is December 1st. So you would need to have your application materials in by then. And it's been lovely spending this past hour with you. I hope you all have great evenings. Thanks again, and hopefully we'll be chatting with you soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay. Have a good night.
Yeah, bye. Thanks.